what's the purpose of fasting? Can I make God do whatever it is that I want if I go on a hunger strike? Is fasting about changing God's mind, or is it more about changing your own? Join us today on Living the Message as we discuss questions like these and many others about eating disorders and even helping your children to fast. It should be a good one. Hey, this is Living the Message, where we discuss how the message of Christ might dwell among us richly. I'm Pastor Eric Targe, and I'm here joined by the senior pastor of the Moody Church, Philip Miller. Hey, Philip.
Hey, Eric. How are you this morning?
I'm doing well.
Good.
Doing well. We talked about fasting.
I know.
This week in the sermon. And to be honest, I think probably 95 or 98% of the people there were not looking forward to it. Like, who likes to be told not to eat, to not drink? And that just doesn't sound like a fun message. And yet I feel like I've heard from so many people that the message was exciting, relevant, and really countercultural, just not what I think a lot of us were expecting when looking at this passage about fasting.
Yeah. Crazy.
So why do you think that is? Why do you think we're excited about fasting? Or maybe what were some of the wrong views about fasting that we dispelled, or maybe we just weren't thinking about?
Yeah. Well, I think sometimes we come in with expectations of what this is going to be. It's it's like, oh, fasting. I don't do it. I'm going to feel bad and feel guilty. And what I think we tried to do is just kind of frame it out and say, this is why it actually matters. Here's the biblical theology of it. And I do think it's dramatically countercultural, right? I mean, we live in a culture that says whatever desires are in you, just go follow those. Follow your heart. Yeah. That's the way to life.
Listen to your heart.
Right. And this fasting is all about self-denial. It's about look your desire in the eye and tell it no. Yeah. Right? Which is and it's part of the way of Jesus, right? Take up your cross, deny yourself, and follow me. And so there's a whole lot of denying our desires and actually transcending, getting above, and mastering them in the Christian life. And I think to help to understand how fasting is actually a tool in the tool chest of spiritual formation so that I can grow into the image of God, that I think is empowering. And I hope that's what people were feeling.
Yeah, I think one of the points that you brought up that was incredibly helpful was focused on how fasting is a form of training. You talked about how Jesus took 40 days to prepare himself to say no to other greater temptations by taking 40 days of fasting. And I just think of so many people who have fallen in the faith, and I just wonder. I'm hey, some of those temptations, some of those tests, what was your fasting life like? And even as we question, right. You regularly hear people say, "Oh, there by the grace go I," in different ways, and it's well, how are you actually preparing to think of fasting as a way in which you're already beginning to deny yourself?
That's right.
That was just such a helpful paradigm that I don't think a lot of us.
Yeah, it's like going to the gym. You're building muscles so that when a strong desire comes along, you're able to say no to it. So start with food and then build up to lust and anger and all those other things, right? But just by starting with something small, like a meal, and learning to feel the bodily desire and actually tamp it down and say no to it, you're actually building spiritual muscles. Because the big desires that come along, the temptations that can take us down, you've got to be strong enough to face them. Right? So it is a kind of training.
Totally. And there's many angles to this, right? So there's the training angle, the prepare yourself, but there's also the question of what does fasting do spiritually outside of us? So we got a question that was texted in. Want to encourage you always to text in questions that you might have for us at 312-682-1888. Again, that number is 312-682-1888. Here's one of the questions we got this week. Someone said, people often speak of prayer and fasting fasting together, right? I think
Yep.
we know that. And in fact, it comes up in Sermon on the Mount. You brought that out, that this follows in that list of prayer, fasting. What was the other one?
Giving.
Giving.
Yep.
So, sorry, back to the text question. Even Jesus in Mark 9:29, with reference to an evil spirit, said, this kind only comes out with prayer and fasting. How does fasting enhance the potential of our prayers answered? Sometimes I feel like if I fast, God will be more persuaded and willing to answer my prayers. Can you help with this?
Yeah.
That's interesting, because you're like, you don't want to have I got to press the right buttons on God to get him to answer.
Right.
But there is something about
Yeah,
doing this.
there
Why?
is a connection between prayer and fasting, especially it's a way of expressing kind of earnestness. Like even today in our culture, we say, put your money where your mouth is, right?
Yeah.
Like in other words, words are cheap. And so like to just say, hey, I want this, or this is what I'm praying for, or whatever, fasting is kind of a way to put our money where our mouth is. It's sort of like saying, no, I'm serious about this. Like it really matters to me. And it's a way to show the sincerity, the authenticity, the importance of whatever it is. And so I do think there is a sense in which God responds to earnestness in ways that he maybe doesn't respond to something that's a little bit more flippant, right? The change really is in us, right? We're like if my kids come to me, they see something at the store, oh, I want that, right? And I know it's just because they just saw it.
Yeah.
And 5 minutes later, they're going to see something else and they're going to want that, right? So it's not a mature desire. It's not something I really, really want. I know as a dad, I can filter some of that out, right? But then when my daughter comes back 2 weeks later and says, remember that thing that, like, do you think maybe one day I could have one of those? And I'm saving up some money, and I'd like to, like, if it keeps coming back, it's like, oh, now I'm thinking Christmas or birthday or, right? Because I know it matters to her.
Yeah.
Because it's not just a bunch of words. It's now matured and it's more substantive. And so I think fasting functions a little bit like that with God. Like it demonstrates sincerity, and I think he values that. Right.
So how does the denying oneself fit into that? Because I think one of the things that some people maybe misunderstand, or I think probably from this question, I'm not saying this person misunderstands it, but it does kind of sometimes feel like, oh, fasting is my hunger strike, right? It's like if our kid does that, we're like, oh, it's just a tantrum. Like, hey, I'm going on a hunger strike in order to get God to give me this thing.
Right. Which is bad.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, so we're back to, like, in the context of the Lord's Prayer, Jesus is talking about prayer, and he says, don't be like the Gentiles who are like just putting together magic words and formulas and trying to push the buttons on the vending machine to like get the treat they want.
Yeah.
And if we reduce fasting into a manipulative tactic, God sees right through that too. So so that's not what this is. It really is. I think it's about earnestness, and if we think about it as like, no, this really matters to me, and it matters enough for me to take a season of time to devote with earnest attention to this topic, this need, this repentance, or whatever. Right? Yeah. I think there's a sincerity to that rings true, and I think that's the thing. It's not about the food; it's about the sincerity. I think that's what God's responding to. We see it in other things. Like Jesus says, if 2 or 3 of you meet in my name, like I'm there. And like if you ask, he talks about the persistent widow who comes back again and again and again asking. And it's like God's going to respond to those things when you come as a group, when you come repeatedly. I think it's the sincerity that's demonstrated in those things. When you have a group when all my kids come together, it is more and ask me for something. It's more powerful than if just one of the kids comes. Yeah. And if it's repeated, if there's sincerity to it, it's like I know this really matters, and I attend to that differently. And I think it's a real dynamic with God that he's interacting with us, and he wants to see sincerity. Yeah.
I think that brings us to another question on maybe fasting going wrong, right?
Yeah.
Fasting can go wrong if you're focused on manipulation, trying to just get God to bend to your will. But fasting can also go wrong, I think you brought out, if it's thought of as a completely singular thing and not a community thing. So I'm curious, what do you say about those who, like, regularly, they're used to fasting accidentally through lunch or breakfast,
Right.
right? It's like, well, I missed
Just
lunch
like,
and I missed
yeah.
breakfast because they're just addicted to work. And now they think, oh, well, today's a fasting day, or I'm going to incorporate fasting. And it's just used as an excuse to keep working, just work, work, work. I was telling you earlier, I was listening to a podcast where they were talking about the work laws in France. In France, it's actually illegal to work through lunch, which is so interesting. Yeah, they actually require you to leave your
Take a
desk,
break.
take a break, and all that. They said they want you in community. And so, like, in America, we're so individualistic, and I think this is where it's probably the hardest. We tend to be so work-focused. What do you say to those people?
Yeah, yeah.
How do you fast well in an individualistic society when
Right.
fasting is supposed to be community, I think?
So skipping a meal to do more work is probably not going to yield a lot of spiritual benefits, right? The whole point we went through in the sermon, I won't repeat it all, but there's three main functions that are happening in fasting. We're attending to the spiritual.
Yeah.
So we in other words, we're replacing the time that we're eating with an attentiveness to our spiritual life. So prayer, scripture reading, communing with God, communing with God's people. There is all of that happening. We're starving the flesh, which is, saying no to our bad desires, saying no to even like food is a good desire, but in order to say no to bad desires. And then we're feasting on God. So we're attending to his presence. So I think the merit of fasting is not in the skipping of the meal. It's in what we then do in its place.
Yeah.
And so to just do more work is probably, I'm saying no to like food, which could be a little bit of an idol, but I'm just transferring my time and energy to a different idol, which might be my work, instead of like stepping back and like creating a Sabbath rest, separation, fasting in order to attend to the spiritual side of my life. That's where the benefit's gonna come. So, and so I would just encourage people. Like really use that space. Like if you're fasting for a day or whatever, you're getting a minimum of 3 hours back, right?
Yeah.
And so like, what would it look like to take those 3 hours intentionally to cultivate the spiritual side of your life? It's not just, oh, I did it. I got through the day. It's what am I doing? What am I saying yes to while I'm saying no to this? That's the key thing.
That's so helpful. And I think one of the beautiful things is that as a church, this Wednesday, we're doing a day of prayer and fasting. So those who are in Chicago, if you're from Moody Church, which I know most of our listeners are, we encourage you to join us for that day of prayer and fasting. We're going to end together in community, which will be a beautiful thing. But one of the great blessings of being an inner city church is the fact, downtown church, is that so many people work downtown in the city. And so even though they may work in different companies or in different buildings, they're actually near each other. Would you have any recommendations for how to use that lunch hour? I mean, even here on staff at Moody Church.
Yeah.
How should we use the lunch hour?
Well, it would be interesting. Like, so you could do it by yourself, where you're like reading your Bible and praying by yourself. Or you could get together with somebody else. Like, there's a thought, right? Maybe actually take that time to get together and pray. We're going to have some Zoom prayer times as well. And so, like, I think that communal aspect, it really, you see it when you realize that in the first century, like 5 to 6 hours of the day were spent preparing meals.
Yeah.
And like, can you imagine if you were the person dedicated to preparing meals for your family or your extended family or whatever in the first century, and the whole nation does a day of prayer and fasting, right? On like Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, right? Everybody gets like so much time back.
Yeah.
And that's huge, right? What a blessing to people that are making those meals and like the time that they get in community and to attend to the spiritual side of life. That's beautiful. And so there is value in doing it communally as well. And so taking advantage of that, of the connections and those, that's huge.
Yeah, taking advantage of the time to rest in God's kingdom instead of seeking to continue to build our own.
Yep.
Because I think that's where maybe some of us get distracted. It's like, oh, great, more time to build my kingdom, to do more work, because now I don't have to eat. I'm told by my pastor not to eat, right? But it's like, no, to actually focus on resting in his good gifts and feasting on him. I love that phrase, feasting on God. So some people, when they're fasting, make allowances, right?
Oh,
like,
yeah.
So I'm curious from you, what do you think about that? Like, is it okay to drink coffee tea. I know, like, so as you know, I was raised Jewish, and at the synagogue, they would regularly say, like, you shouldn't even brush your teeth. Like,
Oh,
because
wow.
that was like, just some people like just like to get the
Right.
sensation of breath. They're like,
Right.
no, that's breaking the rules. A good friend of ours likes to drink hot chocolate in the afternoon before prayer meeting. So what do you
A
say?
little calorie dump, yeah.
A low, yeah.
So
totally, yeah.
it's all liquefied.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Can I have a smoothie? Can
Yeah, totally. It's
Yeah.
like, what's the proper
Yeah.
allowance? Are you
Right.
allowed allowances, or should it
Well,
be?
so I don't think we want to be too legalistic
No,
about it.
no,
Like,
no.
so I think you need to know your body. You need to know the dynamics of everything but fasting's supposed to be hard. I mean, it's not supposed to be easy. It's supposed to cost you a little bit.
Yeah.
There's a sacrifice involved. It ought to, you ought to feel hungry.
Yeah.
So if you're finding ways to prop that up so you never feel hunger, that's probably not. It's not the spirit of the thing, right?
Yeah.
But we're so fast to like try to create rules around it, and the whole point is it should be sacrificial. It ought to be saying no to appetite. So you should feel the appetite so you can say no to them. It ought to be giving you time back. But you don't want to like turn it into a legalistic prescription where you have to, turn it into craziness or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think there's lots of ways to fast. Like if you even think about it, like Sabbath is fasting from work. Solitude is fasting from people. Silence is fasting from talking. There's in some sense, prayer is fasting from control.
Yeah.
Giving is fasting from consumption and reliance on the safety that money can provide. So, I mean,
Yeah.
like in a sense, almost everything we do spiritually has a bit of a fasting component.
That's so interesting.
If
Yeah.
if we leverage it, right, and recognize like this thing, like in giving, I tend to be reliant on my money. And so like, what's the right level to give? Well, the 10% guideline is there in Scripture. But the point is, give till it hurts a little. Because until it hurts, until you've sacrificed, you're not actually using it as a spiritual discipline, right? Like if giving is actually God's way of freeing us from money, from the tyranny of money, like I need to feel it or it's not actually doing anything for my soul beneficially, right?
Yeah.
So like that's the threshold. So with fasting, I need to feel it.
Yeah.
So fast until you feel it. That's the threshold. Until you feel it, it's not actually doing anything for you. So if you can easily skip a meal and don't even hardly notice, like that, you got to go further than that, right?
Yeah.
And so like that's the principle. So I would just say, make sure you're feeling it, the sacrifice of whatever it is you're fasting of, and then you've kind of hit about the right level.
Yeah. This is really helpful. We've been getting questions in about all sorts of things regarding this, on how to do this. What are the things that we should make allowances for in it? In fact, I think this next question is one that's really applicable to that, and I think adds a little bit of nuance. And so again, we want to encourage you, text in or email in your questions. Remember, the email is livingthemessage@moodychurch.org. One word, livingthemessage@moodychurch.org. This is the question we received. How would you counsel someone that has struggled with restrictive or disordered eating in the past, but genuinely wants to make fasting a part of her spiritual life without falling into unhealthy patterns again? I think as you were preaching this message, I was thinking of people I know in my life who are like this listener, and I'm looking forward to the counsel that we can give them on how to do this in a healthy way. What would you say?
Yeah. So this is again, the principle is to work against desires, right? So in this case, because maybe this person is just like anorexia, right? It's like I just don't eat enough.
Yeah.
So in this case, the appetite that's actually disordered is not the one related to the food, but the one that's related to the body image. Right? So in this case, it might actually be a better fast to eat. If you think about it. I mean, because you're working against the disordered thing.
Yeah.
It might be better if you do struggle with food-related disordering. to actually not do fasting with food primarily and fast in another category, like fasting from your phone, fasting from social media, fasting from screens, fasting from eating out, or fasting, or whatever, right?
And when
like
you say food disordered, just to clarify there, what you're saying is if you have a desire, you have an over desire to not eat, similar to like us, we all have a disordered relationship with food.
Yep.
We often have a desire to overeat. That's why you want to not eat. And
the general tendency is overeating.
Yeah.
And so that's where this is.
Yeah. So if you're coming from the other end of the spectrum.
If you're coming from the other end of the spectrum, you probably should think through this differently. Because the principle, again, is training yourself to be the master of your own appetites.
Yeah.
Right? By the Spirit, this fruit of the Spirit is self-control. How do you learn that? Fasting is a tool to help you learn self-mastery, self-control, to say no to unhealthy desires as well. So you're training on that. So it may be because food is maybe the dominant issue in your life, that maybe it's easier to start with something else and learn those muscle movements.
So what are some things they might do?
So like media fast is easy. I know people that will fast, like again, Sabbath is a fast from work. You might fast from sharing your opinion online. You might
Can't say
fast.
amen, say ouch.
I know somebody who realized that he really enjoyed giving the last word on things. He was kind of an expert personality, and so he learned to fast from saying the last thing. Oh, wow. He would let someone say something stupid, and he wouldn't say anything. And right, I mean, that's a kind of fasting. It's so I think just search your own soul. Think of the things that are patterns for you, that are dependencies, that things that are just like weirdly important to you, and just say, I'm going to try to go without that. So somebody might have like their favorite little treat drink, and they have it at the end of the day, every day, or whatever. Like I like root beer, and that's kind of a treat drink for me. Like that's a good thing to just give up. And then when I'm like, oh, I really want my treat drink or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Like what does that say? How do I use those appetites as I'm saying no to them to say yes and say, God, just like I'm craving this, I want to crave you. I don't crave you like this.
Yeah.
But help me to crave you, and like help me to be less dependent on this and more dependent on you, and like to start pulling the punch through of the appetite, and that's how it becomes spiritually useful.
So in your message, you said that in the early church, people would fast like twice a week. Is that right?
That's right.
Which is kind of wild to think about twice a week when we're struggling, I think, to do it once a quarter in a year. But it's interesting. I think for most people, they would struggle to think, okay, how do I not eat food twice a week? But this broader understanding of fasting, maybe that's something we should be thinking about doing twice a week. What would you say to that? That could maybe even help us to build up to broader
again,
fasting.
the principle is what matters, right? And I think food is the easiest one because you need it so often, right? It's just 3 times a day, maybe more, right? Like we're constantly eating, so it's a primary tool, but it's not the only thing, right? And so just learning, there's creature comforts that we can say no to. There's all kinds of niceties that we could, and again, Jesus' point is don't do it showy. Don't go around with your face haggard. Like the point is just just quietly train your soul, so that you increasingly are able to be the master of your own appetites. There's so many things, Eric, that go wrong in life because we just can't say no to what we want, right? No to our desires. We impulse buy things. We get in credit card debt because we can't budget and control. We get addictions, all kinds of, sexual problems and appetite problems. Like it's all around this, Disney has told us for so long, just follow your heart, whatever, dig down deep, find your desire, and you follow that, and that's the way to life. And there's nothing that could probably be less biblical than just follow your heart, right? I mean, there's all kinds of things in our hearts that are not worth following. And something, we see it in the fall when Adam and Eve give into their appetite and they sin against God, right? And then there's, from that moment on, in a sense, our bodies have become the boss of our spirit.
Yeah.
And the Holy Spirit has come into our life in many ways to rectify that situation, to put our spirit back on top, the way we were made to be, right? So like the fall is not just, the world is not just broken out there. Like I'm broken in here, and the Spirit is reorienting the entire inner condition of my life so that I'm now the boss of my body. Yeah. And there's a million things, like, I sometimes I think the guy in the mirror is my biggest problem, right? Because if he could just behave, I would be skinny and rich, right? Right? Like I would be,
totally, yeah.
But I'm my biggest problem. And like the Spirit is coming, and one of the fruits of the Spirit is self-control. And he's trying to make me actually do the thing I really want to do, right? That my deeper desires would actually win out. Yeah. And that's what a right humanity looks like.
Yeah.
So
I feel like this conversation is really helping me now to just think, okay, how am I going to live the message this week? I know like that's what we're all about. And like now I'm thinking, okay, so twice this week, how can I find one of those things, whether it's having the last word, I love that, right? Or social, I don't really do social media, but finding like that thing that I so crave and saying, you know what, at least for 2 days a week, I'm going to focus on one of these. And I'm going to begin to build that muscle of fasting, because you brought it out. It's prayer, giving, and fasting. If someone said, oh yeah, I haven't prayed in the last week or the last month, we'd say you're spiritually unhealthy. If someone said, yeah, I haven't given over the last month, you'd be like, really? Like you should address that. Like we're supposed to be giving. But if someone said, oh yeah, I haven't fasted in the last 6 months, we would be like,
me too.
Yeah, me too. Or even in the last 2 weeks, we'd be like, oh, whatever. It's just fasting. And Jesus doesn't seem to view it that way.
No, when you fast. These are the big three.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to recognize they're the primary tools that we've been given to train our souls in the ways of righteousness. Yeah. Like we ought to leverage them, right?
Yeah.
We ought to leverage them.
So I know how to live the message a little bit more now. But if we're discipling other people, especially the little ones in our homes, that feels like a different story. So I know you got a question in by email, and I was having a conversation with some friends on Sunday night, and we were talking about this very thing of how do you help kids to fast. And so I'm curious, kind of going maybe just for a moment on the different age ranges. My child that's able to fast, I have a 2-year-old, not going to make him fast, not even 2 yet. And I have a 4-year-old.
Right.
So my 4-year-old, how can I get her to fast? And then one of our listeners, regular listeners, hey Les, Les was actually asking this question about his kind of almost teenagers and teenage daughters. Okay, so what do you do in those different ages and stages? How can we disciple our children into fasting? Especially when like kids need food. Like,
right.
I'm not going to tell my 4-year-old she can't eat.
Yeah,
all
they're
day.
going through growth spurts and all that.
I feel like that would be good.
And plus, as a parent, you don't want hungry children, right? Like we all know there's a lot
That's too many things I would have to suppress in a day.
Right.
You know?
So one thing to keep in mind is I would treat this like in our family. We wait till our kids profess faith in Christ and then make sure they know what they're doing before they get baptized, right? Like we wait a little longer to let's say yes to our kids being baptized just because they're young and we want to make sure they know what they're doing. So I would say a similar principle with kids when it comes to fasting. Like you want it to be something they want to do. It will not do much good spiritually for them to just be drafted along if they don't want to actually obey Jesus in this area, right? So so I would say ask your kids, you heard the message on Sunday, and we want to follow Jesus. We follow Jesus as a family, and we're trying to figure out what does it mean to take this seriously. What are your thoughts? Right? And let them process. And I would say that's the first step. Like figure out because if they have a desire for obedience to Jesus in this area, like that, then we can come up with a customized plan, right?
Yeah.
And then I would say, like my wife and I were having this very conversation
really?
About our own kids. Yeah. And like, what are we going to do? And my oldest two really wanted to, they were in the service and they heard the message and they really want to, like, we have to do this.
Okay.
And
they're going to do a full fast.
well, so this is the conversation
Okay,
we
here we
had.
go.
and where they landed was that they were going to give up all their snacks.
Oh.
So all their little treat snacks that they have during the day, but they're still going to get their protein and their main basics at their 3 meals, but they're going to give up their snacks.
Yeah, because they're
throughout the
little
day.
kids. It wouldn't be healthy.
They're not going to have chips, and they're not going to have their little juice boxes, and they're not going to have little ice cream after, right? So
Yeah.
they're gonna give up their snacks, and so that's their fast. Mom and Dad are doing the meals, right?
Yeah.
But again, we don't want to be legalistic about this. Like, the point is, like, build your own adventure, but do it in a way that fits age and stage. So I would say that's a great principle. Maybe as kids get a little bit older, skipping an entire one meal maybe makes more sense.
Yeah.
Whatever. I don't know. I tend to, like, so my cheat on fasting is, like, I still drink coffee. And it's because the world does not like Philip Miller when he doesn't have his coffee. Now that's probably a sign that I actually need to, because I'm probably more addicted to coffee than I would like to admit, and that's probably something I should build up to. Right?
Okay, yeah.
So I'm just being honest, confessing.
Yeah, hey.
But right now, like on Wednesday, I'm still going to have my morning coffee because I don't know how to function as a human being without a little bit of coffee in the morning. So, and that's, but I'll do the other thing. So, like, again, I build your own adventure, but do it in a way that's meaningful to you. And I think allowing your kids to say, this is where, let them drive it.
Yeah.
Let them come up with what they're going to skip.
Yeah, that's good.
I mean, just like I'm encouraging all of us to do that, right? And so I think we do that with our kids too. As long as, and then you may have to say no, like you can't skip all 3 meals because you need at least a little bite of chicken or a little bit, like, right, throughout the day, because we all know you're growing and you need fuel, right? So anyway.
Well, that's incredibly helpful. Know your age and stage. Know what your limits are. Know know what your desire actually is, and if it's working against it. Whether you have an eating disorder or if you have type 1 diabetes, know that you can make good choices and still say no to the flesh and feast on God.
Yeah.
Oh, this has been incredibly helpful. If you have any questions about the message or you enjoyed this message, this conversation, be sure to check out the message that went along with it. In fact, we would encourage you each week to be thinking deeply about the message and join in on this conversation. As we said before, the number to text in your questions is 312-682-1888, or you can email us at livingthemessage@moodychurch.org. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to like and subscribe, give us a rating, and if you think it's helpful, share it with somebody else. Get Living the Message into your friends' hands. Let them know about what we're doing here. We truly hope that you were encouraged, equipped, and enabled to now go and live the message.